What's up, Buttes and viewers? My name is Kiss, and welcome back to KTB Network. So, today I'm reacting to the choice-based game trend by Autumn J. Diaz. Now, I see in the thumbnail, there's Life is Strange and Detroit Become Human, two of my favorite games. And I will say that Detroit Become Human had me a little bit annoyed because, okay, North, right? As an interest, I have to say this. As a love interest, North is fine. But at the same time, she was a warmongering motherfucker. Like, excuse me for cursing, but she was really like, she had a hard on for war, you know, and there wasn't any kind of like character development in a way where she calmed it down. She was crazy until the end, okay? So it would have been nice to have another female for Marcus as a contrast to North. You know, that way we could see the docile and the aggressive type, and we get to choose or have a choice on, because I did some research on Simon, because they had some chemistry, and it had romantic undertones. So it seems to me that they were at a bit of a time crunch and they couldn't finish the game and insert that into the game. So could have been Simon because he was a pacifist too. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, that's basically what I had to say off the top of my head. That's my one gripe with Detroit Become Human. Other than that, sometimes I'd leave North on her ass alone when she pissed me off, you know. But otherwise, I taught her who was boss. But yeah, let's react to this video. Let's see what he has to say. Let's see what's up. Or she, excuse me.
This action will have consequences.
Yes.
Is a phrase that can bring fear into the soul. I'm the kind of person who will
Not the sweating. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because you don't know which choice is the worst consequence.
reload a game if I make a decision that a character doesn't like. But really, how much choice do we have inside
Yes,
a
but later.
choice-based game?
Bye.
Many of us have played through choice-based games, making the most thoughtful, careful decisions only for the game to play out the same way if we had made the brash and thoughtless one. Choice-based games have existed since the days of Choose Your Own Adventures. These puzzles were books where you would pick one of the labeled actions and then skip ahead to what page the book told you to go to see how that action played out. If you died or made a
Really? It happened in books? Oh, I gotta read me some books now. More often, actually. Because to those of you who know me and have been to this video channel before, sometimes I don't have enough time to read, so I have word of the day here on my phone. Word of the day is malingerer, a person who pretends to be ill, especially in the cases of work. So, you know, to expand my lexicon, but, you know, I want to find this book and read it.
the wrong choice, then you would go back to that choice and try a new one. However, there was
If you have any suggestions, if you've read these kind of books, let me know in the comments down below.
a big trend that took place somewhere around the 2010s
Oh,
where
I
the
loved
new
that
concept
game
of choice-based
so
video
much.
games were taking off. Telltale and other video game studios were jumping on this concept, claiming it had never been done before. That wasn't true at all, though. Video games have taken this approach and have been making choice-based video games since visual novels. Visual novels have the ability to make multiple branching paths due to their design as a story and text-based games. They could resemble Choose Your Own Adventures because of this. Meanwhile, bigger video game companies didn't go this route. Instead, they chose to make 3D or CGI choice-based games. Now, there's nothing
Yes, of
inherently
course. Makes
impossible
sense.
about doing a choice-based game outside of a visual novel format. However, there are a lot more disadvantages when you take away the text-based format. For one, how do we make several branching paths for a game with acting, 3D models, CGI, writers, and a budget of a normal game?
Detroit Become Human did it best. There were so many alternate routes you could have taken. It was very much like a text-based, whatever she's saying.
It's far more possible with visual novels, in which case the only thing that you would need to be duplicated is the writing and possibly the voice acting or a few frames of art. However, if we want a fully rendered scene for every single branching path
Wow,
in a
I hope they got
AAA
paid
video
an adequate
game,
amount of money for
can
this.
we really have that many branching paths? This led to several choice-based video games either having a lack of branching paths or a lack of consequences for choices. At
Yes.
some point it even led to a lack of continuity. Take for example Detroit Become Human. a game that prides itself on its branching paths.
Yes.
However, each choice has its own cutscene and reaction to it, despite all of the choices you made previously. Connor has a deviant route and a machine route. If you take the deviant route, you choose to spare androids and care about people around you, sacrificing results for the safety of others, even if they're robots. If you take the machine route, then you only prioritize your mission and don't take other people into account. During this game, you can choose to shoot one android to gain information. If you do this, Hank will lash out at you, saying he's betrayed that you would do this. He comes to the conclusion that you really are a machine, and he was a fool for thinking otherwise, which makes a lot of sense if you did the deviant route.
Anybody notice that Hank's actor is Mr. Krabs?
This way to then choose to shoot the android. But if you were on the machine route, this statement from Hank makes no sense. The entire game, he never thought you were more than a machine, and you do nothing to prove him wrong or get on his good side. If you do the deviant route, Hank has every right to give this reaction, but on the machine route, Hank's belief that Connor is just a robot never should have been swayed in the first place. That's because the scene was written from the perspective of the deviant route. The story was intended to be played out from the deviant route. Therefore, this writing fits into the deviant route rather than the machine route. There are other continuity errors too in making so many branching.
I know this is a hairstyle, right? But it looks like she has horns. Like she's Mantis.
Paths. For one, if you play the deviant route and get the intended ending, the big, bad, evil guys will take over Connor and try to get him to assassinate the leader of the robot rebellion, claiming this was their plan all along. However, if you mess up the mission and get caught, the bad guys will say that they would never let you get away with this and kill you. So then, it wasn't their plan to have you assassinate the leader all along. So we now have a story where two different realities exist depending on which path you choose. In other words, the writers write two completely different stories in order to make their story make sense, and therefore canceling out the choices you make.
Makes sense.
If you choose to succeed, then that was all part of the evil plan and you fell right into it. But if you don't succeed, then they'll kill you, and it was never part of their plan to have you succeed.
That's so confusing.
The reason for this is because the choices in these games don't let you stray away from the main storyline and plot progression. A lot of these games have problems that can be narrowed down by asking if your choice led to one different line of dialogue in an otherwise identical cutscene to if you had made a different choice. This seems especially clear in horror choice-based games. There was definitely a trend of horror choice games that was dependent on your ability to save characters. If you miss a QuickTime event, a character dies. You might have to choose between saving one of two characters, or some kind of weird trolley problem. In this type of game, the goal is usually to keep everyone alive. Usually there's a good ending where every character walks out of the game fine and alive. However, there's very little difference in actual gameplay, and your ending only chooses who's standing with you in the final cutscene. For example, in Until Dawn, if you manage to keep all the characters alive, you might have to play more QuickTime events to keep them alive, but the gameplay remains virtually identical and just gives the player another cutscene at the end of the game for every...
Anybody else think that Hayden Panettiere looks like Sabrina Carpenter? Well, Sabrina Carpenter looks like Hayden Panettiere. Some people say Sabrina Carpenter looks like Hillary Clinton, but we're going off on a tangent.
Every character it keeps alive. The two games I talked about have the same issue that this
Clones.
trend of games tended to follow. A narrative that promises branching paths, but just kind of created one intended story with one or two choices that actually have a larger impact on the narrative. Many studios say that they want to give audience the experience of watching an interactable movie, to which audiences said, it's kind of just like watching a movie where you have to hit a button every once in a while.
Oh yeah,
However,
the remaster looks
this is a trend
terrible.
That took place about a decade ago, so has it improved at all? Well, to start, we already had some good choice-based games long before this trend ever took place. While big companies were trying to create high-budget interactable movies, people had been making interactable games for years. We had visual novels such as Dating Sims with multiple unique endings, as well as other interactable games. Take for example the Henry Stickmin games, the first one coming out in 2008 on Newgrounds. These games ended up having multiple paths at the start of every game that would change the gameplay and what route the player went down immediately. The second game included 3 endings, one revolving around stealth, another including head-on combat, and the last requiring you to go to court Ace Attorney style. These games continued to have more endings and more branching paths. Even some would carry over onto later games in the series that would result in a completely different game starting and
If you see a random toothpick, I had to pause the video to eat and come back.
ending point. This type of game resembles a choose-your-own-adventure in its completely separate branching paths, because there wasn't one ending or route set in stone from the beginning. The player actually gets multiple choices that grant narrative freedom. Later games in 2008 on Newgrounds. These games ended up having multiple paths at the start of every game that would change the gameplay and what route the player went down immediately. The second game included 3 endings, one revolving around stealth, another including head-on combat, and the last requiring you to go. Well, to start, we already had it. The second game included 3 endings, first one coming out as other interactable games. Take, for example, the Henry Stickmin games, the first one coming out in 2008 on Newgrounds. These games ended up having multiple paths at the start of every game that would change the gameplay and what route the player went down immediately. The second game included 3 endings, one revolving around stealth, another including head-on combat, and the last requiring you to go to court Ace Attorney style. These games continued to have more endings and more branching paths. Even some would carry over onto later games in the series that would result in a completely different game starting and ending point. This type of game resembles a choose-your-own-adventure in its completely separate branching paths, because there wasn't one ending or route set in stone from the beginning. The player actually gets multiple choices that grant narrative freedom. This is very similar to what many dating sims do, having branching paths depending on what character you pick, and going through a different story completely than if you had picked a different option, maybe even having a few different endings per path. These games are wonderful examples of a choice
These are mobile games, right?
Space game, which is probably because these games prioritize the gameplay rather than the graphics like the first 2 did. Branching paths are much easier to do in a 2D game like Henry Stickmin or a visual novel.
That looks like so much
fun.
I
would
love
like to
Stickmin
point out
games.
that Henry Stickmin has a ton of endings that are all fully animated. It's truly incredible. The amount of effort that was put into this game is incredibly obvious, and I don't mean to downplay that at all.
I want to play that.
Henry Stickmin is a fully animated game with multiple branching paths and endings. That is so commendable and impressive. Highly recommend you check it out. On the other hand, there are games that are meant to comment on choice-based games and the mechanics in them. Of course, I have to talk about Undertale. Undertale only has 3 defined paths: pacifist, neutral, and genocide. Pacifist and neutral play out similarly with very different endings, but genocide is completely different, having you kill every minor character and letting you one-hit kill the bosses. This completely locks you out of any story that the pacifist or neutral run offers. However, it does let you have a conversation with Flowey where the game lore was once told to you. Flowey says that you have the same power that he does, the power to reset. At first, Flowey tried to be kind to everyone and play peacefully, but eventually he got bored. He asked himself what would happen if he went back and started saying different things, doing different actions, even killing people. This is meant to represent the mentality that we have in choice-based games. Typically, we try our best to win the game and get a good ending for all the characters that we've come to know and love. But if the game is worth a replay, if you love the...
I did that on The Expanse. I didn't like what happened in a certain ending, which I should have probably just... I should have kept my original ending, but I didn't like that route.
Game enough, many players might ask themselves what would happen if they go back and pick the worst options. This is just curiosity about the game and understanding that there's no real consequences to your in-game action. But this is a story game that is about growing close to characters and being kind to them because you believe their happiness is as important as yours. If you choose to kill a character out of curiosity, the game will consider you less than human. If the characters' lives are worth less than you finding out what happens if you make that other choice, you don't deserve a pleasant experience, and the game refuses to give you one, giving you next to no dialogue, removing half of the characters, not playing the background music, even changing the fun flavor text. There are only 2
What?
bosses from now on, both excruciatingly hard and unforgiving. The rest are just one button press. This game actively punishes you for your curiosity to play every aspect of the game. This is typically the appeal of choice-based games, that there are many
Wow.
options and you can uncover them all. But with Undertale, the game is here to remind you that your worst actions are forever permanent and the game will never forget what you did out of sheer curiosity. This type of game plays around choice and the
This is
idea
why I
of
like
a
saving
choice-based
going back,
game
just to
in order
make sure.
to turn the analyzing lens back on the player. This way, the game is still choice-based, with 2 completely separate paths, but the purpose is to examine the player's tendencies rather than to invite the player to try every option available. The same can be said about Deltarune, though I can't talk much about that because the full game has yet to come out. But it does appear to be doing interesting things with the choices in games, even if it might not seem to be from the first chapter. These games have a way of having 2 choices, but that choice defines the entire game. There are definitely a few choice-based games that have 1 or 2 important choices, while the rest won't drastically change the story in any way. And that can be interesting commentary, to say that we as people can make a long string of choices only for one to be very relevant. Of course, one of the big components of this trend starting was Telltale, a studio that focused on making
I remember
choice-based
that
games.
scene.
Their most famous series
Yeah, no,
being
that
The
one
Walking
wasn't.
Dead.
That
The
one wasn't
Walking
very
Dead
good.
focuses on character relationships and world
Walking
building
Dead is
over
good.
a branching narrative.
Not Back to the
Telltale's
Future.
The Walking Dead is what many game studios base their entries into the choice-based game trend on, despite the previous examples coming years prior. This game has some aspects used in Until Dawn, like controlling who lives and who dies throughout the narrative. This game does a set narrative, similar to Until Dawn, Detroit Become Human, and Life is Strange. Telltale was probably the first game to set up major choices that are different from minor choices. There tended to be one major choice at the end of each chapter. The same could be said about the games I mentioned before,
Kenny will
with
remember
there
that.
really being one choice per chapter that carries over and matters. The biggest choices and the ones that really affect the game are separate from the smaller choices, which will affect a smaller thing down the line. This is also the mentality taken in Life is Strange. The story reads differently from the specific examples I've used, considering
Oh, I
it's a
love that
much more
music.
slice-of-life game. There are a ton of small decisions that you can make in this game that don't really affect the story. You might stop a girl from getting hit by a football, get a question right in class, or water a plant. Of course, we've all experienced picking dialogue options and then it coming out a different way than we intended, or having a completely unforeseen consequence than what we could have predicted.
I have
That's
this
one of the
song on my
most
on
annoying
my
things about
playlist.
choice-based games in my eyes. For example, choosing not to fight someone, and then that unforeseeingly leading to someone else having a heart attack. I couldn't have known that would happen, and I wouldn't have made my choice the same way if I had known. Life is
Right.
Strange actually manages to get around that. The main character, Max, has the ability to go back in time, usually for a few minutes at a time. This means that if you say something and it came out completely wrong and that isn't what you wanted Max to say, you can rewind and pick another option. This is great.
That's where Life is Strange shouldn't have deviated from Max's rewind powers, because that's what made it stand out so much.
Greatly appreciated as someone who restarts save files if I pick a dialogue option that a character doesn't like. This way, a player can be sure of all their choices, rather than forcing a player into a quick decision that might make them frustrated with the gameplay. Much like Detroit Become Human, Until Dawn, and many Telltale games do by giving the player a time limit. Life is Strange has successful gameplay because it allows the player to think through all of their choices. Furthermore, the end of the game is the one choice that matters. This might be frustrating for players that want more branching paths, but in a slice-of-life story like Life is Strange, the point isn't branching paths. It's about looking back on the small decisions you made in order to make the world a better place, and deciding what is important to you. The end of the game is basically a trolley problem, and the player has made choices throughout the game to put effort into certain relationships, into certain structures, into Max yourself, and it all leads up to asking the player, based on the choices they made, what are they willing to sacrifice? If you chose to neglect certain people or the town you're in, you might pick a different option than if you chose to prioritize them. A big question that this game poses is if the town itself is worth saving, and if you've spent the entire game trying to fix its problems and help people, you might think so. The same goes for your best friend Chloe. Is she worth saving? Only the player has the
Yes,
answer to
I
that
saved
question.
her.
And this is one game where the final decision is often split because people prioritize different things. Life is Strange doesn't believe that every choice you make affects the world around you, but it does believe that the choices you make impact you. But to explore the relationship between player and game, the Stanley Parable explores what free will is inside of a video game and how it works in a choice-based game. In this game, the narrator has a set path for the player to take where they follow through his intended story, but the player has many options to derail that story.
So many
this game becomes a
screens.
fight between the player and the storyteller. The storyteller puts so much effort and thought into making this game only for the player to do things their own way. But the story would not exist without the player. Without the player interacting, it's stationary. The game concludes that both the player and the storyteller need each other. It's an interesting interpretation on games and free will. The true ending is the player making a decision that the game says isn't intended. It's an interesting play on players being able to glitch the game or do unintended things. In one secret that's designed to look like a glitch, the game gives you a choice, a simple yes or no answer. If you answer no, the narrator will ask the player, is there really a meaning to this choice?
Oh, here comes the real question. What do you think would have happened if you had told me that you wanted this to stop? Do you think it would have been particularly different? Would I have taken the same idea but rephrased it superficially to fit that answer? Perhaps you never would even have thought of it if I hadn't brought up the issue in the first place. Oh, now think about it. Will it be worth it for you to restart and then come back here just to do the other option? Clearly, this whole gag takes some time. What if the other option is even longer? How long will you spend in total just to have heard all the narration? Oh, and this is Rich. Perhaps you've just played the other option, and now you've come to see what happens in this
I would
one.
press yes.
So,
Oh my goodness, you're
what do you
talking
think?
so much.
Which
Then again, I
choice
talk
was
a
the
lot.
better one?
The game asks you if it's worth finding out what the other answer is. It is worth it, by the way. You get a beautiful song sung by the narrator.
There once was a man named Stanley, who people considered so manly. But the truth must be told, he was not very old, and was quite particularly gangly.
Yeah, didn't see that one coming, did you? But it does bring up some interesting points of what is choice inside a choice-based game, when the consequences are already picked out in advance. Determinism often asks, if there's a higher being which knows every outcome and knows what choice we will make before we make it, do we really have free will? And if there is a set story the creators want us to follow, why have they written other endings? What is the point of choices in video games? If we give the player agency, will they be fighting against the writers? Maybe the reason is to have a relationship between the player and the storyteller. The player's interaction is what makes a video game rather than a movie. Choice is everything in a video game, even when it isn't intended. And when it isn't intended, it still should be cherished by the writers because that action creates a player's experience in the video game. The writer and the player need each other to make a video game.
Very
even if the
Matrix
player goes
coded.
directly against what the writer wants. That's still their playthrough. And in any game, it's possible to go against storylines and opposite directions of what is intended, so why not embrace it? Players have broken shooter games by simply trying to do a pacifist run. People will always find glitches
That's
and
interesting.
interesting ways to break the game. Speedrunners have been doing it for years. That
Yes, I've
itself
done that
is a
too.
very different way to interpret a game. Choice-based games might actually
Interesting.
offer the player less free will by constraining their choice to a few options.
I've done that glitch when it comes to Assassin's Creed Valhalla to get the Odin Spear ahead of time.
But at the same time, doesn't that then create an
And I think I went through Excalibur's trial. Yeah, I did.
interesting relationship between the storyteller and the player? There will always be games where it feels like choices don't matter, and you as the player are sidelined into one story. But there will also be games made with the intent of giving players freedom of choice, opening the world up to them, or just giving them the choice to grow attached to the world they're in. Small decisions will always have some kind of effect on the world we live in, even if it's minimal and feels unimportant. Not everything in these games needs to be a branching path, but there are some wonderful
I didn't know
stories
you
that
could
are
do
here
that.
to provide audiences with a multitude of options and adventures. Later games are starting to integrate this in
Love
with
Baldur's
games
Gate.
like Baldur's Gate 3 or Slay
Yes.
the Princess. Two
Yes.
incredibly different games with incredibly different choices that impact the story and the player greatly. Still, these games have been branching out and exploring the meta and atypical side of things for the past decade. Now that the choice-based trend is over, I hope that we see people who want to make choice-based games rather than make a game with choices in it. There's a lot of room for exploration still, and there's a lot of good inspiration coming from these games. If you're looking for good choice-based games, I would encourage audiences to look into indie or smaller development teams because they tend to put their budget into making a good story, gameplay, and mechanics rather than bigger studios who might prioritize graphics or larger actors. This trend has died out, but choice-based games are still going, and I'm happy to see them branching out in their own unique ways.
Well, I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't say the craze for choice-based games have died out. I would say it's just beginning. I feel like, especially with everything advancing so much, and I don't know. I feel like it's just beginning. Perhaps she means the trend of certain games like with The Walking Dead. But they just have to I don't know, come up with some ideas for us. But it's an informative video. I might check out, what is that, Stanley Stickmin something? That looks like a fun game. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Let me know what other gaming videos you want me to react to. Like and subscribe if you become a today, and I will see you guys in the live streams. Take care, and thank you for stopping by.